How has your day been so far? Hello, we're AITA Stories, and today we're sharing a brand new original story with you.
Victoria Reynolds had built her life the way some people built empires. Brick by careful brick, with gates high enough to keep the world out and standards high enough to keep disappointment away. She lived in a home that looked effortless from the street, all clean lines and quiet luxury, but nothing about it was accidental. Every detail said the same thing to anyone who understood the language of money and control. Order, success, and the expectation that everything under this roof would stay that way. Her friends called her strong. Her neighbors called her impressive. People who worked with her husband called her formidable, the kind of woman who could look at a room and immediately know what belonged and what didn't. Victoria didn't correct any of them. She let them believe it was natural. She let them mistake discipline for ease. And at the center of that carefully managed world was her only son, Lucas. From the day he was born, Victoria had looked down at him and felt something that was not just love, but certainty. Lucas wasn't ordinary. He wasn't meant to be. He was the proof that everything she had endured, everything she had built, would matter. She didn't say it out loud, not in those words, but she lived it in 100 quiet decisions that shaped his life before he was old enough to shape it himself. There were pictures in the house that Victoria liked more than the ones from vacations or anniversaries. Lucas at 3, grinning with a book open on his lap, pointing at letters as if the world itself had finally started making sense. Lucas at 6, muddy knees, scraped palms, eyes bright with the kind of curiosity that could turn dangerous in a second. Lucas at 12, shoulders already squared, standing too close to the edge of a creek bed while other boys shouted behind him, daring him toward something reckless. Victoria remembered the day he stuck a metal hairpin into an outlet. She had stepped into the hallway for no more than a moment, just long enough to answer a call, and then the sound hit her, sharp and wrong, followed by a scream that didn't feel like it belonged in her home. She still remembered how her hands shook as she pressed him to her chest while she waited for the ambulance, whispering his name over and over like it was a prayer she could force into reality. There were other close calls. A fall from a tree, a bicycle crash that left him dazed and bleeding, an X-ray that made Victoria's heart stutter before the doctor said the words she needed to hear. A dog bite when he got too bold in a neighbor's yard. Lucas moved through childhood as if the world was a challenge he could outsmart, and Victoria moved behind him like a shadow, catching him when she could and punishing herself when she couldn't. She told herself it was just his nature. He was spirited, fearless, a leader. People were drawn to him. Teachers praised him. Other parents mentioned him with the kind of admiration that came laced with envy. Even as a teenager, he had that easy charm that made people laugh at his jokes and forgive him when he pushed too far. At graduation, he wore a suit Victoria had ordered from a tailor weeks in advance, because if Lucas was going to be seen, he was going to be seen properly. He looked like success in a photograph, the kind you framed and kept where guests would notice. Victoria watched those guests notice. She counted the glances. She heard the compliments. She absorbed them like proof. Charles Reynolds stood beside her during those moments, quieter, steady in the way a man became steady after decades of building and rebuilding. He was a work-focused man, the kind who believed responsibility spoke for itself. He didn't hover. He didn't micromanage. He thought Lucas needed room to become a man, not a child tied to his mother's apron strings. When Victoria worried, Charles shrugged it off. When she planned, he asked if she was overthinking. When she questioned who Lucas spent time with, Charles reminded her that Lucas wasn't fragile. He didn't understand what Victoria understood, that intelligence and confidence didn't protect a person from consequences, and that one reckless choice could undo years of careful effort. Victoria loved her husband, but there were moments when she looked at Charles and wondered how two people could stand in the same house and see such different risks. To Victoria, life was a ladder, and you climbed it by keeping your hands clean, your image sharper than your rivals, and your circle carefully chosen. The wrong friends were dangerous. The wrong habits were dangerous. The wrong partner was disastrous. Status mattered because it wasn't vanity, it was insulation. Achievement mattered because it bought safety. Proper matches mattered because love without stability was just another form of risk. She told herself these beliefs came from wisdom, from experience, from knowing how quickly things could fall apart if you trusted the wrong person. And still, even in her pride, there was a quiet anxiety she couldn't name without feeling superstitious. Some nights, she would pause in the hallway outside Lucas's old room, listening to the silence, remembering the sound of his childhood laughter and the way his footsteps used to race through the house. Her world had been built around him. That was the truth she never admitted in polite conversation. Lucas was her greatest achievement and her greatest vulnerability. And Victoria Reynolds, for all her certainty, could not shake the feeling that the world would eventually try to take him from her. Victoria Reynolds had not been born into wealth, and she had never forgotten what it felt like to measure life in careful increments. She grew up in a modest home where money was discussed in hushed tones and security always felt conditional. Her parents worked hard, worried harder, and taught her early that comfort was something you earned, not something you expected. There were no shortcuts in that house, only discipline and restraint. When she met Charles, he was young, serious, and ambitious, a man who carried plans in his head even when his pockets were nearly empty. He wasn't charming in the way other men were, but he was reliable, and reliability felt like safety. Victoria married him before she was fully certain of what love was supposed to feel like. But she was certain of one thing: with a man like Charles, she wouldn't fall. The early years were lean. Small apartments, second-hand furniture, long evenings where Charles studied or worked late, and Victoria learned how to stretch meals and expectations. She didn't resent those years. She treated them like an investment. Every sacrifice was temporary. Every compromise had a purpose. When Charles's career began to take off, when promotions followed one another and paychecks finally matched the effort, Victoria felt vindicated. She had chosen correctly. Comfort arrived quietly. A better neighborhood, a larger house, vacations that no longer required months of calculation, furniture chosen for quality instead of price, the kind of stability that let you forget what instability felt like. By the time Lucas was old enough to remember, struggle was something that existed only in stories Victoria told, usually as lessons. They became, unmistakably, an upper-class family. Not flashy, not careless, but secure. The kind of secure that made doors open a little faster and mistakes easier to absorb. Victoria understood what that security meant, how rare it was, and how easily it could be threatened by poor choices. Lucas was born into that comfort, and Victoria decided early that he would never have to claw his way up the way she and Charles had. When people asked if they planned to have more children, she smiled politely and said they were happy as they were. The truth was less casual. One child meant focus. One child meant no divided attention, no diluted resources. She wanted Lucas to have every advantage, every opportunity, every form of protection she could provide. Charles questioned it once or twice, suggesting that siblings might teach Lucas balance or humility. Victoria disagreed. Love, she believed, was not infinite in practice, no matter how infinite people claimed it to be. Time, energy, patience, worry, these things had limits. She didn't want Lucas competing for any of them. She wanted him certain, always, that he was the center. So she poured herself into him, his education, his activities, his future. She learned which schools opened doors and which merely pretended to. She learned the difference between talent and potential, and how to cultivate both. Lucas thrived under that attention. He excelled. He stood out. And Victoria felt the quiet satisfaction of a plan unfolding exactly as it should. Then, Slowly, the plan reached its natural conclusion. Lucas grew older. He talked about universities with a confidence that startled her. He spoke of cities beyond Connecticut, of independence, of living on his own. When the acceptance letters arrived, Victoria smiled and congratulated him, but something inside her tightened. Higher education was expected. Independence was inevitable. She had prepared him for this, had she not? Yet, when Lucas packed his belongings, when his childhood room began to look less like a space waiting for him and more like a space he had already left behind, Victoria felt something she wasn't prepared for. The house grew quieter in ways she couldn't control. Her routines no longer revolved around his schedule. Decisions no longer required her approval. Charles adjusted easily. He filled his time with work, with meetings and projects that demanded his attention and rewarded it with purpose. Victoria watched him leave in the mornings and return in the evenings, unchanged by the shift that had unsettled her so deeply. For the first time in decades, she felt unnecessary, not unloved, not abandoned, just peripheral. Lucas called. At first often, then less so. He spoke with excitement about new classes, new people, new freedoms. Victoria listened, smiled, offered advice he didn't always ask for. She told herself this was normal, that this was success playing out exactly as planned. But beneath that logic was a quieter fear she couldn't dismiss. If her role as a mother was ending, what was meant to replace it? Victoria Reynolds had built her identity on being needed. And now, as her son stepped into a life that no longer required her constant presence, she felt the unsettling sense that relevance, like wealth, could be lost if it wasn't carefully defended. At first, the distance felt temporary, like the adjustment period everyone warned her about. Lucas had moved away after all. New routines took time. New responsibilities demanded focus. Victoria told herself that independence didn't happen all at once, that even the most devoted sons needed space to stretch. But the space kept growing. Their phone calls changed in subtle ways that were difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt compressed, as if Lucas were always half-turned toward something else. He answered her questions politely, efficiently, but without the warmth that used to soften his voice. Laughter became rare. Updates turned vague. When Victoria asked how he was really doing, he responded with practiced ease. "Everything's fine, Mom." Fine became his favorite word. Fine and busy. Victoria noticed how quickly he ended their calls, how often he checked the time, how his attention drifted. She could hear it in the pauses, in the way his answers landed just a second too late, like he was deciding what version of the truth required the least effort. At night, she replayed those conversations in her head, dissecting tone and timing the way she once dissected school brochures and application essays. Something was off. She couldn't say what, only that the Lucas she heard on the phone didn't sound like the boy she had raised. Then the requests began. They were reasonable at first. Books that cost more than expected, a security deposit adjustment, a campus fee that hadn't been mentioned before. Victoria transferred the money without comment. She wanted him comfortable. She wanted him focused on success, not distracted by logistics. Soon, the explanations multiplied. A seminar he needed to attend, a laptop repair, rent that had increased unexpectedly. Each request came with a reason, delivered casually, almost apologetically. Lucas always made a point of asking her not to mention it to his father. He didn't want Charles to worry. He didn't want to seem irresponsible. Victoria agreed, even when the amounts began to climb. Even when the excuses started sounding recycled. She told herself this was part of supporting a young man finding his footing. Life was expensive. Education demanded investment. Still, a quiet discomfort settled in her chest. Lucas had never been careless with money. He was confident, yes, adventurous, yes, but he understood value. He had grown up watching Charles build stability inch by inch. Financial recklessness didn't fit the picture Victoria carried of her son. When she finally mentioned her concerns to Charles, he waved them off with a tired smile. "He's an adult now," he said. "College costs more than people expect. You worry too much." Victoria bristled at the dismissal. Worry to her was not a flaw. It was vigilance. It was what kept disasters from unfolding unnoticed. She tried again, pointing out the pattern, the secrecy, the growing sums. Charles shrugged. If there were a real problem, he'd tell us. That answer unsettled her more than he realized. Lucas had always told her things. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. Enough to reassure her that she was still part of his inner world. Now, she felt like an observer looking through a pane of glass. She noticed how Lucas avoided certain questions, how quickly he changed the subject when she asked about his social life, how he deflected any inquiry that might lead too close to emotion. The warmth she missed wasn't just affection. It was honesty. Victoria began watching the calendar more closely, marking when he called and when he didn't. She listened for background noises, trying to place where he was who might be nearby. She caught herself wondering what he wasn't saying, what he might be hiding to protect her or himself. Some nights, she lay awake long after Charles had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling and tracing old memories backward. Lucas as a child, fearless and bright. Lucas as a teenager, confident and adored. Had she mistaken confidence for invulnerability? Had she believed too strongly in the version of her son that made her feel secure? She wanted to drive to see him, to show up unannounced, just to look at his face and reassure herself that he was still whole. But she didn't. She told herself that doing so would push him further away, confirm every accusation of control she feared others might make. Instead, she waited. Victoria Reynolds had spent her life preventing problems before they became crises. She recognized the early signs of collapse the way others recognized weather changes, subtle shifts that only mattered if you ignored them. And now, as her son drifted farther from her grasp, she felt a growing dread she couldn't name, only sense. Something was unraveling in Lucas's life. She didn't know what it was yet, but she knew, with the certainty of a woman who had built everything she loved by paying attention, that this distance was not harmless. Lucas did not announce the meeting the way Victoria expected. There was no build-up, no careful preparation, no attempt to ease her into it. He simply called one evening and said, almost casually, that he wanted them to meet someone important. Her first reaction was not excitement. It was calculation. Victoria asked where they would meet, what time, how long Lucas planned to stay. She asked questions the way she always did when something unfamiliar entered her world. Lucas answered patiently, but without elaboration. When she pressed him for details, he deflected with a tone that felt deliberately neutral. "You'll see," he said. "She's normal." The word stayed with her long after the call ended. They met at a quiet restaurant near the edge of town, the kind of place that tried to look understated but failed in ways Victoria noticed immediately. The lighting was wrong. The service was attentive but not polished. It was, in her mind, an odd choice for an introduction that was meant to matter. Anna Miller was already seated when they arrived. Victoria registered her in pieces before she registered her as a whole. Plain coat, sensible shoes, hair pulled back without effort or ornament. Anna stood when they approached, smiling politely, hands folded in front of her like she wasn't sure what to do with them. She was younger than Victoria expected, slim, almost fragile-looking, with a softness that suggested neither ambition nor threat. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but steady. "It's very nice to meet you," Anna said. Victoria returned the greeting with a smile that was practiced to perfection. She shook Anna's hand and felt nothing that resembled confidence in the grip. Nothing assertive, nothing impressive, just warmth and restraint. During dinner, Anna spoke only when spoken to. She answered questions simply without embellishment. She didn't interrupt. She didn't compete for attention. She listened more than she talked, And when she did talk, it was about ordinary things. Work schedules, long commutes, small, manageable problems. Victoria learned, piece by piece, what kind of life Anna came from. A rural town, limited opportunities, a childhood shaped by financial instability, a family that relied on her early, asking for help she couldn't refuse. She had taken care of relatives when she was still too young to understand what that kind of responsibility cost. She had worked while studying. She had learned to live without expectations. Each detail tightened something in Victoria's chest. This was not a woman who belonged in their world. This was not a woman who understood how carefully success had to be protected. To Victoria, Anna's story didn't sound like resilience. It sounded like baggage. Charles listened differently. He asked questions without judgment. He nodded when Anna spoke about responsibility and sacrifice, recognizing something familiar in it. When she mentioned caring for others, Charles responded with genuine interest. "That's not easy," he said. "Not everyone can do that." Victoria watched the exchange with thinly veiled irritation. Sympathy, she thought, was how mistakes were invited in. Compassion blurred boundaries. People like Anna survived by leaning on others. People like Victoria survived by never needing to. Lucas sat beside Anna throughout the evening. His posture relaxed in a way Victoria hadn't seen in years. He listened to her with quiet attention. He smiled easily. He didn't interrupt or perform. He looked settled. That unsettled Victoria more than anything else. She was used to Lucas commanding rooms, adapting his energy to impress. With Anna, he didn't seem to be proving anything. He didn't boast or deflect. He spoke honestly, even when the truth wasn't flattering. When Anna touched his arm, it wasn't possessive or theatrical. It was instinctive. Victoria noticed how he slowed down around her, how his voice softened, how the restless edge she associated with him had dulled. In the car afterward, Victoria commented on Anna's manners, on her politeness, on how sweet she seemed. Each word was carefully chosen to sound neutral. Lucas thanked her. He sounded relieved. Later that night, Victoria sat alone in the living room, replaying the evening in her mind. She told herself she was being rational, that she had seen this pattern before. A young woman with little to lose and everything to gain. A son who mistook calm for compatibility. She told herself Anna's quietness was strategy, that humility could be cultivated, that neediness often disguised itself as gentleness. And yet, beneath the resentment, there was something else she couldn't dismiss. Lucas had looked happier than he had in a long time. That realization felt like a threat. Victoria Reynolds had spent her life believing she knew what was best for her son, sitting in the silence of her carefully ordered home. She felt the first sharp awareness that someone she never wanted had already begun to change him. Victoria did not learn about the marriage the way a mother was supposed to. There was no announcement, no careful conversation, no attempt at inclusion. She discovered it by accident in the most ordinary and humiliating way possible. Lucas had left a document open on the dining table during a brief visit home. A folded envelope tucked between papers he assumed no one would touch. Victoria noticed it while clearing the surface, her eyes catching on a familiar format. The kind she had seen only a handful of times in her life. A marriage certificate. For a moment, she stood very still, reading the names again as if repetition might change the meaning. Lucas Reynolds, Anna Miller. The date was weeks old. Her first reaction was disbelief, sharp and disorienting. Then came the heat, rising quickly behind her eyes and down her spine. This wasn't just news. It was an exclusion, a decision made without her, finalized without her presence, reduced to paperwork, discovered like a mistake, left behind. When Lucas returned to the room and saw the document in her hand, he stopped short. The pause lasted only a second, but it told her everything she needed to know. He hadn't planned to tell her yet. Maybe he hadn't planned to tell her at all. "You're married," Victoria said, her voice controlled to the point of fragility. Lucas nodded. Yes. There was no apology in his tone. No defensiveness either. Just confirmation. They hadn't had a ceremony, he explained. No guests. No celebration. It hadn't seemed necessary. They wanted something simple. Private. Private. The word felt like a verdict. Victoria smiled because that was what she did when she felt exposed. She congratulated him. She asked practical questions. Where did they register? Had they considered insurance? What about housing? Her voice was calm, even pleasant. Inside, something collapsed. That night, after Lucas left, her anger turned inward first. She questioned herself. Had she pushed too hard? Had her silence been misinterpreted as indifference? Had she misjudged how far Lucas was willing to go to claim independence? Then the anger turned outward. It didn't come in the form of confrontation. Victoria didn't shout. She didn't issue ultimatums. Instead, she did what she knew best. She applied pressure where it couldn't be easily named. She began asking questions framed as concern. How were they managing financially? Rent wasn't cheap, after all. Student loans had a way of growing when you weren't careful. She reminded Lucas how expensive life became when responsibilities multiplied. She spoke of budgets, of planning, of how quickly love could become burdened by reality. Anna, she noted aloud, came from a background where money was always tight. That kind of upbringing left marks. Habits were hard to break. Expectations were different. Dependence, once learned, could become comfortable. Lucas listened without interruption. At first, he answered patiently, the way he always had. He assured her they were managing, that Anna worked, that they were careful. Victoria nodded, then continued. She mentioned how generous people sometimes attracted those who needed rescuing. How easy it was to confuse gratitude with love. She never accused Anna directly. She didn't need to. Implication did the work for her. She expected Lucas to retreat, to grow defensive or quiet or uncertain. That had always been the rhythm of their disagreements. This time he didn't. She's not dependent on me, Lucas said, his voice steady. She never has been. Victoria paused, surprised by the firmness. He continued, carefully, as if choosing each word with intention. Anna has supported herself for years. She supported others, too. She didn't marry me for security. If anything, she's the reason I learned how to take responsibility for my own life. The words landed heavily. Victoria tried to redirect, to soften the moment with a reminder of how much she had done for him, how much she had sacrificed to give him the life he now enjoyed. She spoke of gratitude, of family loyalty, of respect. Lucas didn't raise his voice. He didn't interrupt. He waited until she finished. I love you, he said, but you don't get to decide who I marry. And you don't get to question Anna's character because you're afraid of losing control. The sentence struck with precision. Not cruel, not dramatic, just true. Victoria felt something unfamiliar in her chest, a sharp mixture of betrayal and powerlessness. This was not the son who had once sought her approval in everything. This was a man standing between her and the authority she had always assumed was hers. She said nothing after that. Silence was safer than revealing how deeply the wound had cut. Later, alone in her home, Victoria replayed the conversation again and again. She told herself Lucas was blinded by infatuation. That time would restore balance. That reality would correct his confidence. But beneath those defenses was a realization she could not ignore. The marriage had already changed him, and for the first time in her life, Victoria Reynolds felt the unmistakable fear of losing control over the one thing she had built everything around. The call came in the middle of the night, the kind that stripped meaning from sleep before Victoria was fully awake. Her phone vibrated against the nightstand, relentless, impersonal. When she saw the hospital's number, something in her chest tightened with immediate recognition. She answered before the second ring could finish. Her name was spoken carefully, professionally. There had been an accident. Her son had been involved. She was asked to come to the hospital as soon as possible. Victoria didn't remember waking Charles or putting on shoes. She remembered the house suddenly feeling unfamiliar, as if the walls had shifted while she wasn't looking. The drive passed in fragments, red lights, empty streets. The steady thrum of her own breathing as she repeated Lucas's name under her breath like a plea she refused to make aloud. The emergency department was already alive when they arrived, fluorescent and unforgiving. A nurse met them at the entrance and led them through corridors that smelled faintly of antiseptic and panic. Victoria registered movement, voices. The sound of wheels rolling fast across tile. Everything felt accelerated except her thoughts, which lagged behind, unwilling to catch up to what they might find. Lucas was the first person she saw. He sat on a gurney near the nurse's station, one arm bandaged, a shallow cut along his forehead already cleaned and closed. His clothes were torn, smeared with dried blood that wasn't all his. His eyes looked too large in his face, unfocused, as if he were seeing something no one else could. He stood when he saw her, then stopped, swaying slightly. Victoria crossed the distance in seconds, gripping his shoulders, scanning him for injuries she might have missed. Relief hit her first, sharp and disorienting. He was alive. He was conscious. "Mom," Lucas said, his voice hoarse. She didn't let him finish. She pressed her hand to his cheek, grounding herself in the warmth of his skin. Charles stood back, asking a doctor questions in a low, steady voice, absorbing information the way he always did when things went wrong. It was the nurse who said Anna's name. Anna had been brought in by ambulance, she explained, unconscious at the scene. Severe trauma, internal bleeding. She was already in surgery. Victoria felt the floor tilt beneath her. She turned back to Lucas, whose face had gone gray. "I drove," he said, the words tumbling out without structure. "I shouldn't have. I had a few drinks. I thought I was fine. I thought." His breath hitched. "I didn't see the other car until it was too late." The images assembled themselves against her will. A dark road, headlights, impact, the kind of violence that arrived without warning and never fully left. Victoria closed her eyes, not to block it out, but to keep herself upright. A doctor joined them, speaking quickly, clearly. The injuries were serious. There were complications. The next few hours would be critical. They were doing everything they could. Lucas listened as if each word were a verdict. When the doctor left, something in him collapsed. His knees buckled, and he would have fallen if Victoria hadn't caught him. He folded into himself, pressing his forehead against her shoulder, shaking with a force she hadn't seen since he was a child. "This is my fault," he said, over and over. "I did this. I ruined everything." Victoria held him without thinking, her arms locking around him with instinctive precision. The anger that should have come never arrived. There would be time for questions, for accountability, for consequences, she understood all too well. But in that moment, there was only terror, raw and immediate. Anna was in surgery because of him. Anna, the woman Victoria had judged, dismissed, reduced to a threat. Anna, who lay somewhere behind closed doors while machines breathed and hands worked to keep her alive. The hours stretched into something unrecognizable. They sat in rigid chairs under harsh lights, listening to names called that weren't theirs, watching other families move through the same suspended dread. Lucas rocked slightly, his hands clenched, his guilt visible in every line of his body. Victoria found herself staring at the operating room doors, willing them to open, willing them to deliver certainty. For the first time in years, she felt completely powerless. Money, status, influence, none of it mattered here. None of it could undo what had already happened. When a surgeon finally emerged, exhaustion etched into his face, Victoria stood so fast she nearly lost her balance. The news came in measured phrases. The surgery had been long, complicated. Anna was alive but unstable. She would be moved to intensive care. The next 24 hours would matter. Lucas sank back into his chair, sobbing openly now, his composure gone entirely. Victoria watched him and understood, with devastating clarity, that this night had changed everything. Whatever came next, recovery or loss, forgiveness or reckoning, there would be no return to the life they had known. The consequences had arrived, and they were irreversible. Anna did not wake up. That was the first truth Victoria learned to live with in the days that followed the accident. The machines continued their steady rhythm. The monitors rose and fell with mechanical patience. Nurses moved in and out with practiced efficiency, adjusting lines, checking numbers, speaking in calm voices that never promised more than they could deliver. The doctors were careful with their words. They explained the extent of Anna's injuries in clinical terms that still carried weight. Head trauma, internal damage, complications from blood loss. She was stable, they said, but stability did not mean improvement. She was in a medically induced coma. The longer she remained there, the more uncertain the outcome became. When Victoria asked what came next, the answers stopped being comforting. The local hospital had done everything it could. Beyond this point, the specialists explained, advanced neurological care would be required. Facilities with more experience, more technology, more options, the kind of care that existed in only a handful of places, and came with a cost that was not spoken lightly. They gave her numbers, estimates, probabilities. Victoria listened, nodding, absorbing the information with a calm that surprised even her. She understood money. She understood expense. What unsettled her was not the amount itself, but the way it was delivered, without assurance, without guarantees. The figures climbed into territory where even wealth demanded decisions. Lucas didn't seem to hear any of it. He stayed in Anna's room whenever they allowed him, sitting rigidly at her bedside, staring at her face as if sheer focus might pull her back. When the staff asked him to step out, he obeyed with hollow compliance, pacing the hallway like an animal trapped in a space too small for its guilt. He slept little. He ate less. He spoke only to repeat the same phrases again and again. I should have called a ride. I thought I was fine. I didn't protect her. Victoria watched her son unravel in increments she couldn't control. The confidence she once feared had been arrogance was gone, stripped away by consequence. In its place was something raw and fragile, a man who could not forgive himself and didn't believe he deserved forgiveness. Charles tried to steady him, urging rest, reminding him that blame would not change the outcome. Lucas listened, nodded, and returned to the same silent vigil. The guilt had lodged itself too deeply to be reasoned away. Victoria found herself staying longer than she planned. At first, it was obligation. Someone needed to be present. Someone needed to make decisions, to hear updates, to understand what the doctors were saying when the language grew too technical for Lucas to follow. But soon, obligation shifted into something else. She began arriving early in the mornings before the corridors filled, before the hospital found its daily rhythm. She learned the names of the nurses. She memorized Anna's chart numbers without trying. She sat beside the bed in the quiet hours, watching the woman she had once dismissed breathe with the help of machines. Anna looked different in sleep, vulnerable in a way Victoria hadn't anticipated. Without the polite composure, without the careful listening, there was nothing to judge. Just a young woman suspended between moments, dependent on others in the most literal sense. Victoria caught herself speaking to her. At first, it was practical. She narrated updates, explained what the doctors had said, assured her that Lucas was there, that he hadn't left. Then, without planning it, the words softened. "You need to wake up," Victoria whispered once, her voice unsteady. "He needs you." She didn't recognize herself in those moments. She had spent so long protecting her son from the wrong influences that she hadn't considered what protecting him might mean now. One afternoon, as Victoria sat alone in the room, Anna stirred. It was barely perceptible, a shift in breathing, a faint movement of her lips. Victoria leaned forward instinctively, her heart hammering with cautious hope. Anna murmured something, a name, repeated softly, unevenly, as if pulled from a place too deep for clarity. Julian. Victoria straightened, confusion flickering across her face. She waited, listening. The name came again, barely audible. Julian. Julian! It was not Lucas's name. The realization landed quietly without drama, but it stayed. Victoria sat back, unsettled, watching Anna slip again into stillness. Questions pressed against her thoughts, unwelcome and persistent. Who was Julian? Why did Anna reach for that name now, when consciousness hovered just beyond reach? For the first time since meeting her, Victoria did not interpret the moment as threat. Instead, she felt something closer to guilt. Anna lay here because of choices made by others, because of a night that could not be undone. And yet, even now, her mind reached outward, not inward, not toward self-preservation, but toward someone else. Victoria remained seated long after the nurses returned. Her hostility did not disappear all at once. It fractured slowly. Under the weight of fear and helplessness, she could no longer deflect. Watching Anna fight for survival, watching her son dissolve under guilt, Victoria began to understand something she had refused to see. Control could not prevent loss, and the woman she had judged most harshly was the one paying the highest price. For the first time, Victoria Reynolds allowed herself to wonder if she had been wrong. The name did not leave Victoria's mind. Julian. She heard it again in memory, long after she left the hospital that evening, replaying the faint sound of Anna's voice as it had emerged from somewhere beyond consciousness. It wasn't the kind of detail Victoria could dismiss. Names carried weight. They anchored stories. They led somewhere. She began carefully, the way she always did when she needed information without attention. A search at first, nothing more. The name was not uncommon, but the context narrowed quickly. Music articles surfaced, tour announcements, a face that appeared repeatedly, familiar even to someone who rarely paid attention to popular culture. Julian Reed, a rock musician with a national following, a career that had stretched across years, albums, and sold-out venues. Interviews described him as intense, private, brilliant, difficult to pin down. Victoria stared at the screen longer than she intended, unsettled by how easily the name fit the man's image. The coincidence felt unlikely, and Victoria Reynolds had never trusted coincidences. She read more than she needed to. Old profiles, archived interviews, mentions of past relationships that never quite materialized into public stories. There was no mention of Anna, nothing obvious, but there was enough absence to suggest something deliberately left out. Julian Reed was scheduled to perform in Boston that same week. Victoria did not tell Lucas where she was going. She told Charles she had errands to handle. The decision formed quickly, propelled by a need she did not fully understand yet. She booked a ticket, arranged transportation, and moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime solving problems through action. The venue was already crowded when she arrived, humming with anticipation. Music pulsed through the walls, vibrating in her chest. Victoria stood out immediately. Aware of how out of place, she looked among the leather jackets and restless energy. She did not belong here. That knowledge sharpened her focus. She spoke to staff calmly, confidently, dropping names and explaining her purpose without revealing more than necessary. Eventually, she was directed backstage, escorted past equipment and cables and people who barely glanced at her. Julian Reed was seated alone when she found him, had bowed slightly, hands resting on his knees as if grounding himself before the performance. He looked older than his photographs suggested, but there was an intensity in his posture that made age irrelevant. Victoria introduced herself. The moment she said Anna's name, his head lifted. Recognition was immediate, unmistakable. His expression changed before he could stop it, something raw crossing his face. "Where is she?" he asked, standing abruptly. Victoria told him. She spoke plainly. About the accident, about the coma, about the hospital room where Anna lay suspended between survival and uncertainty. Julian listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with each sentence. When she finished, he sat back down slowly, as if the weight of the information had altered gravity around him. "I never stopped caring about her," he said quietly. Victoria had not expected him to say that so easily. The honesty unsettled her. Julian spoke without prompting, as if the story had been waiting for the right listener. He told her about meeting Anna years earlier, before fame had fully claimed him. She had worked multiple jobs then, balancing responsibility with exhaustion, still managing to show up for others. She hadn't asked for anything. She hadn't needed to. He had loved her deeply, not casually, not temporarily, loved her in the way that rearranged priorities and demanded growth. But Anna had chosen Lucas, not because Julian lacked success or devotion, but because Lucas had been unraveling. Julian described it carefully, respectfully. A severe emotional breakdown, panic attacks, recklessness masked as confidence, a young man collapsing under expectations he could no longer carry. Anna had stepped in quietly. She had supported Lucas through the worst of it, staying when it was inconvenient, when it was thankless, when walking away would have been easier. She had believed in him when he could not believe in himself. She didn't save him for praise, Julian said. She did it because she couldn't watch him disappear. Victoria listened, shame tightening her chest with every word. This was the truth she had never allowed space for. The version of Anna that didn't fit her assumptions. Not opportunistic, not dependent, not quietly calculating an upgrade. Selfless. Julian told her he had let Anna go because he understood the choice. He had respected it, even when it cost him. He had stayed silent afterward, keeping her name out of his public life, protecting what she had built with someone else. She chose him, Julian repeated, and she never looked back. The words landed with clarity Victoria could not escape. Anna had not married Lucas for security. She had stayed because she had already given herself fully when no one was watching. Victoria felt the final defenses fall away. She thought of every judgment she had made, every insinuation, every moment she had framed Anna as a threat instead of a foundation. The humiliation she had felt over the secret marriage seemed suddenly small, almost petty, against the reality of what Anna had done for her son. "I didn't understand her," Victoria said at last. Julian met her gaze, his expression neither accusatory nor forgiving. "Just tired." "Most people don't," he replied. She never needed to be understood. She just needed to be trusted. When Victoria left the venue, the noise felt distant, muted. The city lights blurred as she moved through them, her thoughts fixed not on status or control, but on a woman lying in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. For the first time, Victoria Reynolds did not see Anna Miller as a rival. She saw her as the reason Lucas was still standing. And the realization carried with it a respect that came too late to undo the past, but not too late to change what came next. The change did not come with speeches or apologies. It came with movement. Julian Reed acted the way people with influence do when they decide something matters. Quietly at first. Phone calls placed between sound checks. Messages sent to people who owed him favors and to people who didn't but trusted his judgment anyway. Fellow musicians, promoters, venue owners, people who understood how quickly momentum could be built when urgency was real. Within days, benefit concerts were announced. There was no dramatic public story attached, no tabloid framing, no names splashed across headlines. Julian kept Anna's identity protected, referring only to a woman who once saved someone else's life and now needed saving herself. That was enough. Tickets sold out faster than anyone predicted. Donations poured in from people who had never met Anna but recognized sincerity when they heard it. Victoria followed the progress from hospital waiting rooms and quiet corners of her home, watching numbers climb, stunned by how quickly possibility replaced helplessness. When the total finally came in, the amount exceeded even the most cautious estimates. It was enough. Arrangements were made immediately. Specialists in New York City reviewed Anna's case. Flights were scheduled. Medical transport teams coordinated timing with the precision of people who understood how thin the margin for survival had become. Every step forward felt fragile, but it was forward. Lucas did not argue when plans were explained to him. He did not ask questions that delayed action. He signed documents, made calls, and stayed where he was told to stay. The reckless confidence that once defined him was gone, replaced by something heavier and more grounded. Responsibility. He visited Anna daily until the transfer, sitting beside her bed, speaking softly even when there was no response. He told her what was happening, where she was going, that people were helping, that he was still there. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not promise anything grand. He spoke only of presence, of patience, of waiting as long as it took. Victoria watched her son from a distance, seeing the man emerging from the ruins of his own choices. The guilt had not destroyed him. It had sharpened him. When the day came to move Anna, Victoria walked beside the stretcher without hesitation. She spoke to the medical staff with calm authority, coordinating details, smoothing logistics, ensuring nothing was overlooked. There was no trace of the woman who once measured worth through appearances. At the New York Medical Center, Anna was received by a team prepared for cases that most hospitals never saw. Advanced monitoring, experimental protocols, a level of care that acknowledged how close she had come to being written off. Treatment began immediately. Days passed, then weeks. Progress was slow, uneven, and often terrifying. There were setbacks that left everyone silent with fear. Moments when doctors cautioned against optimism. But there were also signs that could not be ignored. Small improvements, responses where none had existed before. Through it all, Victoria remained. She learned how to sit quietly without controlling outcomes, how to listen without preparing rebuttals. She brought meals for Lucas and Julian when he visited, made arrangements for Charles without complaint, and spoke to Anna as if she were fully present, even when the room remained still. She did not attach conditions to her support. She did not bargain for gratitude. She did not measure her actions by recognition. For the first time in her life, Victoria Reynolds gave without expectation. When Anna finally showed consistent improvement, when the doctors spoke in careful but hopeful tones, Victoria allowed herself to breathe, not with relief alone, but with humility. She stood beside Anna publicly when updates were shared. She thanked Julian without embellishment. She acknowledged the role of every person who had helped, refusing to center herself in a story that was never about her. Lucas changed in ways no lecture could have achieved. He took responsibility for his actions with the law. He accepted consequences without complaint. He adjusted his life to accommodate Anna's recovery, reshaping his priorities around care instead of ambition. And Victoria, watching it all unfold, understood something she had resisted for decades. Redemption did not come from control. It came from accountability, from sacrifice, from choosing to stand beside others when it was easier to retreat into pride. As Anna lay in a room filled with machines that hummed with possibility instead of finality, Victoria placed her hand over Anna's and whispered words she did not expect to say. "You're not alone," she said. And for the first time, those words were not an assertion of power. They were a promise. Anna opened her eyes on a quiet morning, without drama or sudden movement. There were no gasps, no urgent calls down the corridor, just a slow return, as if she had been walking a long distance and had finally reached a place where she could rest. Her gaze moved gradually unfocused at first, then steadier, until it landed on the familiar outlines of the room. Lucas was there when it happened. He had been sitting beside her bed, reading aloud softly from a book she loved, more out of habit than hope. When he felt her fingers move beneath his hand, he froze. For a long moment he was afraid to breathe, afraid that acknowledging it would make it disappear. But Anna looked at him, really looked, and that was enough. Recovery did not come quickly after that. It came in inches, not miles, in short conversations that left her exhausted, in physical therapy sessions that demanded more patience than strength, in days when progress seemed to reverse without warning. But she was awake, she was present, and she was fighting. The family that gathered around her was no longer the same one that had stood divided months earlier. Victoria no longer hovered from a position of authority. She sat beside Anna without directing, without correcting, without managing the moment. She listened. She waited. She learned how to offer support without shaping it into control. There was no hierarchy between them now, no unspoken tests to pass. Victoria accepted Anna as she was, fully and without reservation, not as her son's wife, not as someone who needed approval, but as a woman whose quiet strength had altered all of their lives. Lucas changed in ways that could not be undone. He moved through the world more deliberately. He no longer chased validation or ignored consequences. Responsibility had settled into him, not as a burden, but as a compass. He cared for Anna with steady presence, honoring the patience she had once given him so freely. Julian visited once after Anna regained enough strength to speak. The meeting was gentle and brief. There were no lingering glances, no unresolved tension, only gratitude, shared without spectacle. He had done what he came to do, then stepped back, allowing Anna's life to continue without his shadow. When he left, it felt complete. Victoria often reflected on how close she had come to losing everything that mattered. She thought of how easily judgment had blinded her, how control had masqueraded as love, how wealth and status had offered no protection when it truly counted. What remained, after all of that fell away, was something quieter. Worth could not be measured in money. Love could not be enforced. And the smallest acts of kindness, offered without demand, could carry more power than influence ever could. Before leaving Anna's room one evening, Victoria paused at the door and looked back at the scene before her. Her son reading softly, Anna resting, alive and healing. A future no longer ruled by fear. She did not try to take credit for it. She simply stood there, grateful. And to those listening, perhaps there is someone you once misjudged, someone whose story you never truly heard. Maybe growth begins not with being right, but with being willing to see differently. If this story stirred something in you, take a moment to reflect. Share your thoughts in the comments about forgiveness, about change, about the second chances that arrive quietly when judgment finally lets go.